So I think we're doing very well, working our way through the various different families of instruments and learning about how they make their sounds. So I've got a bit of a sound that I want you to have a listen to and see if you can tell me what it is. A pretty familiar sound, I'm sure you will agree. That was the sound of me blowing across the top of a glass bottle. Most of us have done this at some point or other and have been quite interested to see that when we fill a glass bottle up, the sound that we're able to produce when we blow across the top of it generally tends to get higher in pitch. So in this video we're going to be exploring wind instruments and looking at the ways that sound is made when we blow into them. Out of all the instruments, I think actually blowing across the top of a glass bottle can be one of the most difficult to quite grasp how the sound is being made. It's not the same as a percussion instrument where we're hitting something and that's causing it to vibrate, and there doesn't seem to be any moving parts like in a guitar. So what does happen when I'm blowing across the top of this bottle? Here's the sound once again. Not exactly the greatest sound, but you can hear that it sounds a little bit like the flute and some other wind instruments that we might have come across. So the reason why the bottle is so good for producing a note when we blow across it is because the lip of the bottle provides a sort of sharp edge which helps to divide the air that I'm blowing across it. This sets the rest of the air in the bottle vibrating, and that's what produces the sound. Another way to think about the bottle is as a column of air. The longer this column is, the lower the note that's going to be produced when we blow across the top of the bottle. This explains why as we fill the bottle up, the note that the bottle produces tends to go up in pitch. It's just like the strings on a guitar. When we shorten them by pressing down on the frets, the strings are vibrating faster every second, and that's exactly what's happening to the air inside the bottle. If we look at the place on a flute where the musician blows into the instrument, we'll see something quite similar to the top of a bottle. It's a circular hole with the sharp lip. And this is what the musician uses to get the air in the instrument vibrating. Now you'll see that the flute is a much more complex device than my bottle, but essentially the keys on the instrument perform exactly the same job as filling the bottle up with water. The flute is essentially a long pipe with a set of holes running right the way across the instrument. The same way we think of the column of air in the bottle, we can think of this pipe as being a column of air. Generally, this column of air runs from the mouthpiece, where the musician blows into the instrument, until the first open hole. Here is an early version of the flute, without the complex keys that we see on modern instruments. It's much easier to see all the holes running right the way along the length of the instrument. So the more fingers that the musician puts down onto the keys, the more of these holes that will get covered, which means that the length of the air in the tube that's vibrating will get longer. While all these shiny keys on woodwind instruments sometimes look quite complicated, all they're there to do is to change the length of vibrating air inside the instrument. All wind players work on developing something that's called an embouchure. The embouchure is working out exactly the right way to blow to get the air vibrating in the instrument the way that the player wants. Other members of the woodwind family use another piece of equipment to get the air inside their instrument vibrating, and that's called a reed. With the correct embouchure, blowing across a reed like this will get it to vibrate, and that vibration is passed on to the rest of the air inside the instrument. In addition to developing their embouchure, a wind player has to learn different techniques to start and stop the notes that they want to play. If you think about it, while you're blowing, there's obviously going to be a continuous flow of air moving through the instrument. That means that if you change notes, they're always going to be moving very smoothly from one to the next, and this is what we call a slurred way of playing. But there's sometimes in music, which we've seen already, where the player needs to produce shorter, separated notes, which don't move in this flowing way. To do that, the player uses their tongue to separate these different notes, and there's various different ways they can do that. This is known as tonguing, and it's a really important part of any wind player's technique. Another interesting thing that a wind player can do is what's known as flutter tonguing. This is using the tongue to produce a buzzing effect on the instrument, and it can be a really interesting sound. And so now we've covered the principal instruments of what we call the woodwind family. But there's one very important group of wind instruments that up to this point we've not spoken about. And that is, of course, the brass instruments. We've all heard the really impressive sound that a brass instrument can make. Maybe a trumpet playing a fanfare, or a complete brass band. Now, there's an interesting story behind why fanfares and military bugle calls sound the way that they do. For a long time, brass instruments could only play a restricted set of notes. This set of notes is called the Harmonic Series. Because early brass instruments didn't have any keys, there was no way for the player to change the length of the column of air in the instrument that was vibrating. Instead, it was up to the skill of the player to change his or her embouchure to get the air in the instrument vibrating in different ways. In any tube or column of air, there are certain different frequencies that air sort of likes to vibrate at. These frequencies map directly on to the notes of the harmonic series. So in fact, early brass players did have quite a limited range of notes that they could choose to play, which is why a lot of fanfares do rely on this small group of notes, because early players didn't have the option to choose any different notes. Nowadays, modern instruments have introduced keys that the player is able to use to add different lengths of pipe to his or her instrument. That means that effectively, the column of air inside the instrument is able to be made longer or shorter by the player. But to reach all the different notes that the instrument is capable of producing, the player still needs to be able to control his embouchure to change the speed of vibration inside the instrument. So talking of wind instruments, it's probably time to take a breather there. But you can see that there's a huge range and interesting variety of sounds that we can make with this family of instruments. And they probably make up about half of the players in an orchestra. So next time you see a glass bottle lying around the house, why not see how many different sounds and pitches you can make with this very basic wind instrument?